Dissident we did last night. There and that, and
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome, and welcome to everyone who's tuning in online. This is, I feel like, turning into a bit of a streak. We had a great event last week with Yaroslav Trofimov of the Wall Street Journal talking about his new book about the war in Ukraine. And then this week, we've got another terrific book to talk about, David Herszenhorn's The Dissident, which is a fabulous biography of Alexey Navalny. And then he'll be talking in just a moment with Kaitlan Collins of CNN. A couple of housekeeping rules before we get started. If you have questions and you're watching this event online, please type them into the chat in YouTube so we can feed those into the questions that Kaitlan will be relaying to David. And then we'll also, I think, have a mic in the room and people can just raise their hands and submit questions directly. It is one thing I just wanted to note, which is we are now at the 3-year anniversary mark of Alexey Navalny's imprisonment in Russia. Back when he was poisoned in the summer of 2020, the world seemed pretty horrible to imagine the Russian government putting a nerve agent in the underwear of a major political opponent. The world has deteriorated substantially since then, and I'm sure David and Kaitlan are going to talk about that. But I think it's really important, as we're all gathered here and we're thinking about these issues, is that we are talking about a human being who has made incredible sacrifices for his beliefs and continues to be tormented and treated miserably by his government as a result. So anyways, I'm really grateful to everyone for turning out, and I look forward to what David has to say about this fabulous new book. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, and glad to have everyone here. This is such an interesting book. I really loved reading it, and obviously when we met, we were talking about Navalny, so it's nice to have this moment here, but also to reflect on that anniversary. As I was thinking about it today, it's just amazing that it's been that long, that he was on the plane with his family, with reporters. They were descending into Russia, Flight 936, as you write in your book. Can you just remind us what that scene of where he was supposed to land, what it would look like, and why he didn't ultimately land at that airport?
Yeah, it was quite a wild scene, Kaitlan, and thanks, Andrew, and thanks to Carnegie for doing this for us and to be able to talk about the book, and to all of you for being here tonight. That flight was tracked. It was one of those moments when you realize the power of the internet, and thousands of people were on Flight Tracker watching this flight come in. It was supposed to come into Vnukovo, the airport, sort of toward the southwest of Moscow, and suddenly all sorts of weird things were happening at the airport that didn't allow the plane to land, and it was forced to circle and circle, and there were various excuses. Some debris on the runway, some equipment had gotten stuck, and it was clear that Navalny was not going to be allowed to land there. But meantime, in the airport, thousands of supporters were descending on the airport to welcome him back, and a whole melee unfolded as the riot police started to kick them out into sub-freezing temperatures and try to clear the hall. In the meantime, on the plane, it was another circus atmosphere that you're describing, where the Navalny team had alerted all these folks in Germany media that he was going to head home. This was the date. This was the flight. And so you had reporters packed on the plane. Arkady Ostrovsky of The Economist passed Navalny a note, I think, written on his boarding card, and Navalny answered back, it's like, Arkady, I haven't passed notes since junior high school. What are you doing here? And finally, they got on the ground. But even through that flight, Navalny was insisting that it was all going to be okay. I'm going home. I'm happy. And of course, on the ground at Sheremetyevo, the airport to the north of the city, where they were forced to land, the police were waiting for him, and right at passport control, in front of his wife, he was taken away, kissed her, and it's now been 3 years. It's incredible.
Did he have any inkling that he would be arrested immediately?
He kept saying that he was sure it was going to be okay, but he had to know. This is the question I get all the time, is what was he thinking in getting on that plane? How did he not realize and understand? Was there an element of hubris? For sure. I mean, he was recovering from this crazy assassination attempt, chemical weapon in his underwear in a hospital in Berlin, and Angela Merkel came and visited him in his hospital room, right? And he talked about this as, that's of course, because I'm an important opposition politician. And so he may have thought that he was somewhat above that, he'd been playing cat and mouse with Putin for so long. But in the end, probably the driving factor, and this is part of the book and part of the title, which is that he wanted to avoid ever becoming a dissident, and certainly ever becoming a dissident in exile. He thought this was going to end his political career. And what Navalny was always about, more than the anti-corruption stuff, although he's passionate about that, even more than the anti-Putin stuff, although he wants Putin out, is he himself is a political animal and wanted to run for office, ran for mayor of Moscow, wanted to run for president, and he was absolutely sure that if he stayed out, if he showed that fear, he would end his political career, that he would be known as this dissident in exile who had backed away from a fight. He's also a fighter. That's another aspect of Navalny's personality going back to his childhood, that he's never really been able to back away from fights, even to his own detriment. But he had to know, to some extent, that this was possible. And Yevgeny Albats, who's one of Navalny's political mentors, when I talked to her for this book, said, "We're a nation of prisoners." So I do think there was an element of this where he knew if he was going to take this storyline, he's described it as almost fate, that he has to serve this prison time so that others in Russia don't, that he would end up spending time in jail.
You know, one thing I think that people forget about, or maybe just don't always remember when you're looking at this anniversary, is his health. When he was leaving, he had been in a coma for so long. He had to learn how to do basic things like walking again, and he's just recovering from that when he decides to take this flight.
Learning to walk, learning to talk. He described, and he's done interviews where he described, wild hallucinations, that he would see as he was recovering because of the medically induced coma that he was in and the drugs that he was taking. So yeah, and his wife Yulia said that she understood that she was never going to convince him to stay out of Russia, that was a losing battle. And so what she pleaded with him about was to wait long enough that at least he was recovered, because she said, if and when they try again, we don't know that we can save you. And so he had recovered, but he was not in perfect shape by any means when he went back on January 17th.
And you write that a Russian oligarch had warned him, a Russian oligarch former who had spent 10 years in prison had warned him about what kind of health care, if any, he was going to receive if he was arrested.
Yeah, Russian prison colonies are not a fun place to be, and now he's in a really brutal colony in the Arctic North. He's kept up his good trademark humor, having people post on X for him, "I'm your new Santa Claus," now that he's up by the North Pole. But again, you talked about when we met, it was in Geneva at the Biden-Putin summit.
Which feels like a million years ago.
Feels like a million years ago. And Putin got asked about this, and his answer was he knew. He knew he had these charges. He knew he was going to get arrested. So what is there to talk about? That's it.
But he didn't say his name.
But he did that day, I guess.
Yeah.
Khodorkovsky, by the same token, spent 10 years in prison and was pardoned. And there again, you see people sometimes ask, will Navalny ever get out? It seems unlikely, and yet Putin likes to show that he can toy with people's lives. And so I remember being there at his annual news conference on the day that he announced Khodorkovsky was being pardoned after 10 years. This was once Russia's richest guy, right, the head of Yukos Oil. And it was an aside. The press conference was over, and there was a small kind of scrum of reporters, as happens at the end of these events, and they just sort of announced out of nowhere, like, oh, Khodorkovsky's going to be pardoned. And that, of course, was the main news of the day. And some people thought that would never happen, and yet, there's Khodorkovsky now working from outside to change Russia.
And what does that say to you about what a future that someone who is doing what Navalny is doing, what that looks like?
Well, the Russian opposition is all in exile now. Obviously, the war has changed a lot. His closest associates are either in exile or now in jail. And in hindsight, obviously, Navalny could have probably done a lot more for the future of Russia had he chosen not to go back. At a point when Putin is prepared to start a war to destroy a country of 40 to 50 million people, what's the fate of one guy? But important to remember the other Russian opposition figures who are also in brutal prison conditions now. Vladimir Karamurza, who's an opinion contributor to the Washington Post, 25 years he was sentenced to for treason. I mean, this is a guy who, his only treason is, urging democracy for his country, or Ilya Yashin, who's a friend and colleague of Navalny's, going back to their earliest days in local politics, a party named Yabloko, which means apple, a liberal kind of progressive party that they were both in. Yashin also thrown in prison. Their names are not as big as Navalny's, but Putin has completely crushed political dissent. Some of Navalny's associates, including a woman who was heading his office out in Siberia where he was poisoned, and he was out there campaigning, trying to draw attention to dilapidated public housing, shoddy construction, the kind of things a retail political candidate would do. She's now been sentenced just recently to 10 years, again, for doing nothing but running successfully for a regional parliament where they had election success, even in those weeks after Navalny's poisoning.
You mentioned all of these opposition figures. It's clear why any of them gets on Putin's nerves. Why does Alexey Navalny have a special place? Why does he seem to get under his skin so much more?
It's a really interesting question. I guess some of it is about Navalny as a communicator. He's so personable, and this is a challenge when you write about anybody like this, not to be seduced by the cult of Navalny and the charm and the humor, because he's very, very funny, but also very cutting. I think the other reason, different people have different theories. I was speaking about Yevgenia Albat's, Navalny's, one of his political mentors, and she says that Navalny is everything that Putin is not, that he's tall, he's handsome, Putin is short, ugly, Navalny is charismatic, Putin is introverted and awkward. If you look at the picture of Navalny's family, the idea of calling him an outsider when they look like a poster of the classic Slavic Russian family, blonde, blue eyes, with the tall wife and the son and the daughter, that. Meanwhile, you have Putin with his, getting divorced on national TV during an intermission of the opera with his daughters who don't even have his own name. He never talks about his family and is, has that spy KGB mentality. So there's one theory that is because Navalny is the anti-Putin. He represents a special kind of a threat because he has appeal as a potential candidate. Would he have ever won a free and fair election? Maybe not, but we'll never find out because Putin doesn't allow it.
How long have you been covering Navalny?
So I got to Russia in 2011, and that was really the year that Navalny was having kind of a breakout moment. I mean, some of it was accidental, and he's talked about this sort of buzz phrase. I mean, sometimes he's a communicator by accident, and a great communicator by accident and by instinct, where he was doing a magazine interview, not a magazine interview, it was a radio interview, and the radio host asked him about Putin's party, United Russia, and Navalny just starts riffing on how awful they are, and they're the party of crooks and thieves, and this just became a buzz phrase, sort of a meme before we thought of memes as memes, and went viral all over Russia on bumper stickers everywhere, and it became known by their initials in Russian, the party of Zhulikov, crooks and thieves. And that happened in early 2011, and almost immediately after that, and it's partly because of the Russian political system where there is no office other than the presidency that holds much power, that people started talking about Navalny as a presidential hopeful and a possible contender, and I think he also internalized that. Then we get to September of 2011, and that's right as I arrived. I had to get two of my kids into school on September 1st. School always starts on September 1st in Russia. And a third was on the way. And so my wife, Christina, was here in Washington waiting to have a baby. And they were, Putin announced with Medvedev that the tandem switch was happening, that they were going to switch jobs again, right? That was a point when Putin had become prime minister to essentially to stay in power as the supreme leader in Russia, but Dmitry Medvedev was serving as president. And that September, they announced they're flipping back, what's known as the tandem switch. And Russians were just outraged, many of them, that clearly their vote meant nothing, that this was so disrespectful. And that was followed by a parliamentary election in December that was fraudulent. And for the first time, cell phone cameras played a huge role. And there were all these videos around of ballot stuffing, just outright fraud. And from there unfolded a series of protests, the White Ribbon protests, where Navalny became a central figure on stage at these mass protests and really developed that gift for public speaking and became a protest leader, an opposition leader, started to go to jail. He spent 15 days in jail. He and his wife also loved to travel, especially at that time of year, and so they'd done another big protest shortly after he came out of prison, and from there went to Mexico on vacation. and over the kind of winter holidays. And he was answering questions and giving media interviews from Mexico about the protest movement. It just shows you how Russia's changed.
And so you're covering him. Did you ever think that you'd write a book on him?
Not then, no. I mean, there was a lot being written about him. It started, maybe the first big profile, Julia Yaffe did one in the New Yorker. Mm-hmm. He was really this internet blogger. It wasn't quite clear that he would become the central figure and the main, enemy of Putin back then. But I did get to cover him over the ensuing years, up close sometimes, these trials on trumped-up charges. In Kirov, Russia was the first big one. It's kind of an awful place at sometimes a year where it's just full of mud. So a lot of us trumped up there to stand in the mud and then be in this courthouse. That was a fascinating case, in part because of the judge, who was Navalny's exact same age. And they come from this generation that Navalny talks about of people born between 1976 and 1982, who were the end of the last kind of Soviet generation. They could remember the Soviet Union. Navalny could remember, being online for milk for his baby brother, or his parents standing on these interminable lines for meat. But that generation, both Navalny and the judge who was hearing this case, were from that, not just that same generation, but born in 1976 in the same year, and both trained as lawyers. Yet one had become this enemy, this leader of the opposition against the state, and the other was now the agent of the state, bringing down a verdict that was preordained, obviously from the Kremlin, pronouncing a guy guilty, ready to ruin his life. And still they toyed with him by, first convicting him and then immediately letting him out on a suspended sentence on an appeal.
And how personally did he take that?
Did Navalny take that?
Yeah.
At that moment, he really gave credit. There was immediate outrage and protests in Moscow in response to that guilty verdict, and the idea that he was going to be in jail and that he was running for mayor at the time, that the mayoral campaign would be cut off. In fact, they set him free only in order to let him run and lose, with knowing that they could put him back in jail at any moment.
That's the cat and mouse game that you're talking about.
This cat and mouse game constantly. I think where he took it really hard was a couple of years later when he was brought up on other fraud charges. A crazy case that his brother was also implicated in, and his brother was given an actual jail sentence while Navalny was sent home on house arrest. And that day, I think, was the worst I've seen him. It was just, they were using, obviously, the brother to cause pain to Navalny, and he just looked crushed.
And what do we know about his brother today?
His brother is out. Obviously served prison time. He's been quite quiet. I don't know where he's living, honestly, right now. But Yulia Navalny has been in Russia. Their son is in school in Germany. Their daughter is at Stanford, Dasha. So
you talk about how he was growing up and how that was so formative for him. And you also write in the book about his summers that he spent near the Chernobyl exclusive zone, and watching that, how it kind of shaped and formed his opinion of the Soviet Union being a disaster, and how that has formed so much of his political basis that is his platform now.
Yeah, so one thing that many, many people, even those who followed Navalny's career, very closely for many years, don't realize and have learned about him through this book is that he's half Ukrainian. That his dad is Ukrainian, that his paternal grandparents are Ukrainian, that he spent these summers as a boy up until he was 8 years old in this village right near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant until one spring when one of his uncles called and said, "You can't send Lyosha this summer, something's happened." And his grandparents had to evacuate, had to leave that house. He's gone back and actually looked through the window and seen, on the floor a jacket that he would wear as a kid. So those were formative years, and it did shape his view. We did a nice adaptation of the book in the Washington Post that looked at his complicated views on Ukraine, and some of those views sound very much like things we hear Vladimir Putin say, that Russia and Ukraine are brother nations, are one and the same country. From Putin's point of view, that's very sinister. For Navalny, that's looking in the mirror. He looks in the mirror and he sees, a Russian and a Ukrainian face back at him. So, he did have those summers in Chernobyl until he couldn't go, and has talked about the lies that followed. Right, this is what you're getting at. His relatives and other residents, being allowed to continue cultivating potatoes from the ground and kicking up radioactive dust. Not being warned, not being evacuated fast enough. Really the sort of lack of response or the botched response.
No response, lies.
By the Soviet officials and the lies, yeah. And there's no romanticism in the way that Putin talks about the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. Navalny definitely does not share that and thinks it's a whole lot of nonsense.
The piece about Ukraine was so fascinating because it's about his views on it and how it's been complicated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what he had said previously about Crimea, essentially not arguing that what happened was correct, the way that it was so blatantly seized, but that it was kind of inevitable that it is in Russia's possession now.
That it is Russian territory. That's one thing that he's emphasized. And again, going back to Navalny as a political animal, there's a lot of flip-flopping in his positions on Ukraine, trying to find a path where he could be true to his values and yet not in direct opposition to a lot of the Russian public, to the electorate that he hoped would choose him as its leader. And so sometimes when I talk about Crimea and try to explain this to Americans, is you have to think about the possibility that at some point America, by a quirk of history, lost South Florida, and not just any part of South Florida, but Orlando. And then there comes along an opportunity for a president to grab it back. And the president grabs it back. And what is the public going to say? This is a violation flagrant violation of international law, or Disney nosh, Disney is ours. Crimea is a place that many Russians have these childhood memories of, that is Russian speaking. Russian is the native language for most folks. So when Navalny says that Crimea is a Russian territory, there's truth to that. Of course, it was also the sovereign territory with internationally recognized boundaries of Ukraine. But he was pressed on this over the years. And since then, and certainly since the big invasion in February of 2022, has come out very forcefully against the war, and that this is illegal, that Russia needs to withdraw, that Ukraine should be compensated with revenue from Russia's oil and gas. But that's a flip-flop and a change, a waffling from earlier positions that were not quite as clear-cut.
And it's a balance of how does he talk about it if he does still in his mind see himself as this Russian leader someday. I mean, how does he balance what he sees and what the international response is, but also with what people in Russia believe about this war?
Yeah, and so I think, that position, the way it's evolved, is a real obstacle to Navalny ever succeeding in politics in Russia. I mean, at this point, given how forcefully he's come out against a war that thousands of Russian soldiers are dying in, that Putin and his entire propaganda machine are telling the country is a worthwhile sacrifice, that it is an existential fight against the West. It's hard to believe that Navalny telling them, in fact, no, this is all for nothing, that Ukraine needs to be compensated, that this is all Russia's fault, that's going to resonate with voters. You sort of come to the conclusion that Russia would not only have to be categorically defeated in the war, but Russian society would have to go through the kind of process we saw in Germany after World War II, this kind of national contrition, and there's no indication of that happening.
Does that speak to what is the title here, which is about him being a dissident, which you say is something that he never wanted to be, that he viewed himself as this opposition leader? And you write about how essentially when he viewed it, it was this sense that he wanted to be seen as this legitimate contender inside of Russia, how Russia views dissidents versus how they view an opposition figure.
So there's no question, it's not just that he didn't want to be viewed as a dissident, and especially not a dissident in exile, which he feared is what he would have become if he'd stayed in Germany or stayed in the West after being treated for the poisoning, but because it has that baggage, that weight of Soviet times. Soviet dissidents, really in his mind took an easy path, and they'd never won anything, so that they were, there was a lot of respect among Navalny and his team for those dissidents, but they thought of them literally as losers, as not having brought down the Soviet Union, of not having achieved anything, of not having won any kind of power or office. And so in that sense, Many of them took an easy path. They escaped. Many of them were welcomed in the West, and then would return later after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it was a far easier path, and so he never wanted to be seen that way. He wanted to be a legitimate political contender. And he also has this, fighting mentality that he didn't want to back away from a fight. But so they resisted this and really despised the title, and certainly didn't like the title of the book.
Did you get pushback?
There was definitely pushback, and Volkov, who was his longtime chief of staff, and we talked about it. Went through all this about the Shestidesiatniki, the dissidents of the 1960s, and why, why that definition, that description didn't apply to Navalny, why he was different, why he was a politician, why they were going to appeal to a majority of Russia in their political campaigns. Of course, this is before the big invasion and the war, but in the end, and this is so interesting, it comes to sort of what happens when you're writing a story that isn't finished yet. So the book was supposed to be at the printer, finished, done last summer, and we knew that there was one more criminal case against him, again, these trumped-up charges, where Navalny was about to be sentenced, and in the end, he got 19 years, which brought the total years that he's sentenced to 30, which is currently the maximum, the statutory maximum in Russia. And so I'd warned the publisher, and everybody knew that we had this court decision coming, and they said, okay, we're going to squeeze in that last number of how many years does he get. And then the book was supposed to be done. But a week later, Navalny had a long post on social media where he described reading Natan Sharansky's book. And Sharansky, of course, widely recognized as a dissident, who left Russia, come back, become a member of the Israeli parliament, et cetera. And Navalny describing, reading Sharansky, about Sharansky's time in prison and recognizing himself in that and embracing finally that dissident label, saying that's him, that's me. And so with a little bit of pleading, we managed to sneak that in to the very end and get the book.
But was the title always the same?
The title was always the same. The title was
you were
always
going to call him a dissident, whether he embraced it or
not. Right, whether he wanted it or not, and that's because it's true. In the end, he's the definition of a dissident, the definition of a political prisoner, right? As much as he can be a politician as well. There are other dissidents who've become politicians, but there's no way to deny that reality.
As he read the book and embraced that title, how did he look at it, though? Because he wants a different ending for himself.
Yeah, he does want a different ending, and it's to be seen. His health, as you say, has not been good, and he's in very brutal conditions. Albatz, again, talk about this mentor of his, if he survives, he will be the president of Russia. I'm not sure. I don't think we're sure he will survive, and even if he does survive, not sure he will be the president of Russia. But certainly his rhetoric had evolved over time, and as some of this dawned on him about how Putin may be done with the cat and mouse and that he was going away for a long time. Some of the rhetoric changed where he added not only that he wanted Russia to be free, but Russia should be happy, which for anybody who spent time in Russia and with Russians, there are many things, but happy is often one of them. So he's asking for a lot on many levels for himself and for the country, and we'll see.
Can you talk about what his time has been like in prison? Because it's gone from different phases to where he is now in the Arctic. But initially, you write about in the book where he's sitting on a bed, kind of alone, reading a book. Maria Butina shows up to film this propaganda piece, basically saying that he's being treated better than she was in a U.S. jail. Can you just talk about how that's evolved from where it was initially, where he had a tea kettle and a television, to where he is now?
Sure. So at the beginning, he was in a sort of a holding prison, a jail in Moscow, close to the courts, even though some of the proceedings were being held in police stations and other places just to deny his supporters any ability to come out. But there were more, slightly more comfortable, I wouldn't say they're comfortable setting where he had like you say, there might have been a microwave and tea kettle, but then to a prison colony about 2.5 hours east of Moscow, and now more recently after being the latest charge, which is for extremism. And again, Navalny is many things, but the idea of him as a terrorist or as an extremist, he's gone back to Russia arguing for for making Russia better. It's hard to see where that has any validity. But because of that extremism charge, he's now allowed to be in the most brutal, the most restrictive Russian prison colony. What in the U.S. we would think of as a supermax or something, and it's cold and it's awful. But also even in the first colonies in the Vladimir region, he would often be put into isolation cells. And there's supposed to be a limit on how often you can be put into solitary confinement and kept for a week at a time. And the minute he'd come out, they'd find an excuse and sort of put him back in. But the scene you described with Butina is one of the more surreal ones where she's let in ostensibly as having an official public position, and she's also a member of the Duma, but she's a propagandist on RT. And if you remember, this is someone who was convicted in the U.S. of lobbying on behalf of Russia without registering and spent time in prison. And she not only made this case that, his conditions were much better than hers, and she would know because she spent time in an American prison, but she also said that his prison colony was, even better than hotels in the region of Russia where she grew up, which you can imagine did not endear her.
It's like a self-own.
To her friends and family back home, exactly. So really quite surreal. But she went in, in this, obviously ready for combat, and it was filmed. And some of Navalny's supporters, especially the women, his press secretary and Maria Pevchik, who's now the head of the Anti-Corruption Foundation, just savaged Putin afterwards. I mean, they were really vicious in their criticism because they were furious about that. To suggest that he's having a cushy time of it.
Also, just reading this book and remembering everyone that she was connected to when she was arrested, and the fact that she was briefly dating the guy who was in and out of the Oval Office days before January 6th also was just it was like so many overlapping circles, thinking of her influence that she had while she was here. So
much overlap.
Patrick Byrne, the Overstock CEO, is what I'm talking about.
And then, there are other aspects about other overlap that points to how Navalny is both a complicated character and also a politician, right? I mean, a lot of her work was for the gun lobby. And Navalny was a pro-gun politician. It's sort of odd maybe in Russia, but it goes to him having been looking all along, even as he was, crusading against corruption, trying to find a political ideology that would resonate with enough Russians to build a majority coalition that could take on the Putin machine. And ultimately it did not succeed. But this is his flirtation with nationalism, again, anti-immigrant sentiment, pro-gun position, stuff that would seem quite anathema to where he started, which was in liberal progressive, what we would think of as liberal progressive politics in Yabloko. But he had gotten very, very disillusioned from his time in Yabloko with this party that just went nowhere, that he thought would represent freedom and freedom of the press and the future of a new kind of democratic Russia, only to see it co-opted, bought off in many ways, its leadership bought off by Putin and the United Russia machine. And so that frustration also led him to break with Yabloko, and he was then flirting with these nationalists. He himself is a nationalist in the pro-Russia, kind of American patriot sense, not in a neo-Nazi sense, but it brought him a lot of grief. And he, in the end, admitted that, in fact, all it did was get him, anger on all sides. No good came of it for him.
And he always seemed to have concerns about relations with Western nations and what things like invading Ukraine, when it was so clear and obvious that buildup was happening, what that was going to do.
Right. No, there is. Navalny also has a lot of disappointment, when you look at his views on the West, that the West is mishandled, and his team still continues this, and they pound now, even with Navalny in jail, on anywhere where they see the West, they think, failing to uphold sanctions or being hypocritical in some way, or when a yacht that is believed to be Putin's yacht they think is on the verge of getting released from dry dock in Italy and somehow returned to him, they go into overdrive to point this out. They really think that and they have a case that they can make that the West Russia policy has failed, and that Putin was appeased all these years, and other imperatives took precedence over really, putting the squeeze on Putin and holding him accountable for what he was doing to the country. Is that the West's responsibility? That's a different question. But to his mind, there was a lot of disappointment there, both internally in Russian opposition political circles and externally from Europe and the United States.
That there are essentially so many ways where, what we saw happen after the invasion of Ukraine, that steps like that could have been taken even before that, after Crimea was illegally annexed, after all of these other moves.
And to squeeze the oligarchs. That's always been the case, that, the amount of Russian oligarch money that would be, sloshing around in London, right? And that kind of embrace where all these big oligarchs, now it causes a different set of issues when his chief of staff ends up writing a letter asking for the West to ease sanctions on Mikhail Friedman, one of the Russian oligarchs. But there have been ties between Friedman and his company Alpha Group and Navalny's anti-corruption foundation going back quite a ways. Vladimir Putin, who was the first kind of head of Navalny's anti-corruption foundation when he created it as an umbrella organization, had been a senior executive in Alpha Group with Friedman and resigned from that. And the Alpha guys were like, look, you want to do work for Navalny, go and do that on your own. But it seems there were ties even since then, so going back 15 years or more. It's Russia after all.
Yeah, I mean, he always he focuses on Putin, but it's much broader and uglier.
And on Medvedev, right, and these now blockbuster YouTube videos that look at the sort of, astonishing corruption on the part of many officials, the prosecutor general and the prosecutor general's son, and showing the luxury hotel that they've built in Greece and the businesses that they've managed to seize in different parts of Russia. I mean, it's an interesting example of how really with the rise of the internet, Navalny was using the various platforms, first blogging, then later Twitter, Facebook, social media, and YouTube, his own YouTube channel, and these videos that in the end became blockbuster like feature films about Putin's palace, viewed tens of millions of times, highlighting this just garish architecture and vast corruption. Of course, at the core of a lot of that was some really incredible investigative journalism done by others that, when it was in print, didn't get a ton of attention, but they managed to package it and bring really slick marketing and presentation to what were some older storylines, but just highlighted the sort of breathtaking corruption.
Yeah, you've brought up his social media a few times now, and this is something that also really stood out to me because they are so savvy, his team is. I mean, he is obviously in this colony, and still just yesterday, they had this lengthy thread, and it was about his frustration with always being asked, why did you go back? Why did you go back? Which is the number one question that he gets, which I think your book does a really good job of answering. But how are they so savvy, and how are they still able to continue to get his message out, despite the fact that it's been 3 years now since he's been arrested?
Yeah, they've got a tremendous following. I think they learned from him and from his instinct. Some of it is just being human and just being relatable and having a lot of humor. The one that stood out for me was one of the protests where again he'd been arrested, sort of swept up off the street, and he's thrown into a police wagon, and from inside the police wagon he tweets, we're in wagon number 1257. Don't blow it up. Just slash the tires. And he just has that way of this sort of great political timing, humorous comedic timing. Some of that would be in court, where he'd just show astonishing disregard for the judge. If it's going to be a kangaroo court, he would show it and just be on his phone, completely ignoring the judge, or would stand up and just rail against them. So definitely a master communicator, and his team has learned from that, and certainly this is strategic, right? This is quite a production. Whether that's the Oscar-winning documentary, they exert a lot of control. They're very careful, and in some ways, I think I'm lucky that he wasn't accessible as I was doing this book, because you hear enough of Navalny's own words to then try to make sense of it. But they are very controlling and very scripted in what they put out there. Often, Yulia Navalnaya, his wife now, will do Q&A format interviews sometimes where the whole transcript is published, but anything where she would be filtered, she doesn't do, even with the journalists that she's known a long time. I mean, they're extremely careful. This is an image that they've cultivated very carefully over these years.
And how have they done that?
Just like that, by knowing that they have control over the access, that they can agree to certain interviews with certain presenters on TV. Yuri Dud, who's an internet TV presenter, with a huge following. They did a big interview with him after Navalny had recovered and come out of this medically induced coma. I mean, also, they learned the hard way in Russia because of the state control over the media and the fact that he would never be allowed on the big federal channels except when he was being portrayed as a criminal, when they were reporting on his alleged crimes, his crazy trumped up charges. Then the Russian public would hear Navalny's name, but otherwise they would never let him on TV. And so he understood both the power of media, but also the difficulty when you can't get any free coverage. Back when he was first starting out in politics, he was involved in kind of this youth political movement called Da, Yes. And along with Masha Gaidar, who was the daughter of the former acting prime minister of Russia, and they did a series of debates, live debates in a setting like this. They were in sort of bars, clubs, and it became among the sort of upper middle class Moscow young political set, like a total sensation. And one after the other, until the Putin's folks started sending these thugs to kind of disrupt things. But because the debates were so successful, somebody had an idea, we should put this on television. And they were going to create a show, and Navalny was supposed to have a role as he was moderating, in person, he was moderating the debates, and he was good at that too, asking the questions of the guests. And after one episode that they taped, it was shut down. And Navalny was certain that order came directly from Putin's sort of media honchos. This guy is not allowed to be on TV. And so some of it came from that understanding of if you can be on media, if you can control the message, this is a core part of the fight. Because
they're just watching all of these other messages that are being controlled.
Right.
What was it like for you to write this book? I mean, what was the level of influence that they tried to have? What did they...
Surprisingly, they didn't interfere too much. Now, I kept a very low profile, and this was on purpose, knowing that, if we were too public about this, there would potentially be quite a bit of disruption. So, without misrepresenting anything, I was sort of talking to these folks saying, working on some longer form stuff, but being very careful.
Very long form.
Yes, very long form.
A book.
Because officially they will not cooperate, and they would not grant an interview or with any biographical project. That was just the outright policy, and I understood that. But they are, for journalists who cover them, and we do this, in my job at the Washington Post, editing our Russia coverage, they can be very, very difficult. They're in, and it's understandable, right? They're in this, what they view as an existential fight with the Putin regime, fighting for Navalny's survival, fighting for the country's future, and they're often fighting with the rest of the Russian opposition, which is another.
And part of that existential fight is that his release date right now is 2051. He would be 75 years old that year. I think when I was looking and reading through this book and just thinking big picture about him is this question is what is next for him?
This is a really sobering question, and especially from my perspective, writing this book and having kids about the same age, oldest in college at the moment, others coming up, and what the cost would be of this imprisonment, of being away and apart from his family. It's now 3 years. We marked the third anniversary this week, yesterday, of being thrown in jail, and knowing that is just. It's just a really brutal, sobering thought of how many years. And it does seem to be a question of who will die first, Putin or Navalny. I mean, it's very hard to see Putin letting him out anytime soon. Again, absent, some great, change and Putin feeling so confident about where he stands, and it doesn't seem that he does, that he would spring Navalny, knowing what Navalny will do once he's free.
And it has had serious impact on his family. I mean, you write also about his daughter. She was graduating high school, I believe, and there was a moment where he felt this need to go to another political prisoner's release because he felt that they needed to show solidarity, and he almost missed her graduation because of it.
He almost missed the graduation, and it's a really poignant moment. It's the only time that Yulia Navalny admits sort of breaking down, because he said he had to go and do this. And of all the people who went to this protest in support of a journalist who had been detained, Navalny was the one who got arrested, and she was sure that he was going to miss missed the graduation, and she was, describes being sort of, crushed, not just, on her own, but for Dasha, for her daughter, who's so close to her dad, and for Navalny, and by whatever strange bit of luck, caprice, as it happened, he was released in time, and he ended up making it to the graduation.
Yeah, but also she seemed to understand why he needed to go, and that his daughter would understand that as well.
That she definitely seems to have come to terms with the fact, as we said, about his return to Russia, that she's not going to win that argument. She's not going to persuade Navalny not to be who he is or to fulfill this role that he seems to think he's fated to. Some of his close associates talk about him viewing their whole operation as if they're a band of superheroes. Out of these, he loves these animated kind of action shows like Rick and Morty, et cetera. And
Rick and Morty is mentioned like 6 times in the book.
And whenever he's on a plane, you see he's
That's what he was
Rick
trying
and
to
Morty,
watch
right?
before he was arrested.
And when he was poisoned.
Yeah, and when he was poisoned.
And
it's a recurring theme.
And maybe he didn't understand that. Unlike a character in Rick and Morty, if you die, in at the hands of KGB assassins, you don't just bounce back and get redrawn into the next episode. But yeah, he's got that view that they're a band of good good crusaders trying to make right in the world. And maybe that's what you need. I mean, he has also talked about this, that if you think too hard about the risk, that you're paralyzed. And so you just can't think about it. That's why he was able to go back, or that's why he do any of these things, despite knowing that they tried to kill him several times, that they once almost killed his wife by accident, that you just can't, if you think about it too much, you get paralyzed by that fear.
Because she was poisoned right before he was. We have a few questions from the audience, and so I'd like to get your thoughts on some of these. This is one that's really stuck out to me because this is obviously one of the most recent stories, which was when his whereabouts were unknown. There was this period where he was missing court dates, his attorneys couldn't get in touch with him, his family couldn't get in touch with him. I mean, that's a moment that's just, for them, must be devastating to not know if it's the worst or what's going on.
It's yes, and also it happens quite often in Russia. And this is, again, one of the challenges we have in covering these things as news events. It happened when he was first transferred. We talked about the sequence of sort of prison settings that he was in. And when he was finally convicted and then being moved from this sort of holding detention center to a prison colony, same thing happened where he disappeared for a few days, not as long. This was a much longer trip. And what he's since described as kind of a crazy roundabout path to get up to the Arctic that turned it into 3 weeks basically, I think, where he was missing, where his lawyers couldn't find him. But again, this is where I described his team as very aggressive and very proactive. Even before he arrived at the first prison colony in Vladimir, they described him there and had a video going about the brutal conditions there and interviewing former inmates there and everything else. And in fact, he was in transit. He hadn't gotten there yet, but they were already announcing that he was there. They sort of knew he would be there, but he wasn't, and they didn't know where he was. And if you watch the sequence, you sort of catch them in the being a little bit too quick. So again, knowing that it's a very perilous moment because anything can happen in this Russian prison setting where he is essentially and they remind us a lot, in the clutches of a government that tried to kill him. At the same time, there is the same bureaucracy pervasive throughout Russian society, even more so in the prison system. And so, there was an expectation that he would move at some point after this latest conviction from one level of a prison colony to the more extreme one, and then resurfaced. But yeah.
How big is his team?
It's a good question. It's dozens still. I mean, they're struggling, and in part because obviously their main fundraising source, their main celebrity is behind bars and can't do that work. One of their big longtime funders had announced that he was scaling back, that it just didn't make sense to be permanently financing, that they have to find a way to be self-sustaining. YouTube revenue, I think, helps with some of that, and they've had again millions and millions of views. So they're working hard, and they still do get quite a bit of donations. But I think the team is in the dozens, I would say, mostly in the Baltics right now. Some of them in Germany. Yeah.
Well, and when it speaks of the fact that they're still living in Russia and what that means for them, this question also stood out to me. It said, how do you think Navalny is perceived by the average Russian, someone who maybe tries to keep their head down, they're not very political? This person says, do you get the sense that his return to Russia is viewed as heroic, or is it viewed as foolish inside of Russia?
Yes. So there was a Russian TV journalist, Yevgeny Kiselyov, who was a Russian TV presenter in Russia and then was essentially forced to flee Russia for his own reasons and moved to Kiev. And he was living and working in Ukraine until the big invasion, and then had to leave Kiev because Russians were now no longer welcome in Ukraine. And I saw him not too long ago in Vilnius, and he said, Navalny is so incredibly brave, and his bravery is absolutely senseless. And so there is that view of brave and senseless, heroic and pointless. They're, depending on, I think, it's a country of 130 million people. So what does the average Russian think? What does the average American think about any given thing? Someone who is watching Russian state television and believes the reports about what a criminal he is and he's embezzling money and it's easy to buy into these kind of conspiracy theories may not have a positive view. Navalny has never been in the mainstream of Russian sort of political ideology. If I had to compare him to somebody in the U.S., it might be a Howard Dean, or somebody who's got a moment, who's got a bit of a following, has this flash.
Minus a scream.
But yeah, minus a scream, maybe a laugh instead of a scream. But has never been, has never had a sustained majority following. Now, that might have been different if he had access to media, access to a free, and fair campaign, which has never happened. But for some Russians, they view him as heroic, as fighting this endemic corruption for all these years. And then others who sort of see him as, a little bit out of touch or focused on stuff that, Russians have a saying amongst themselves that Russia without corruption isn't Russia. There's this fatalism about it. And of course, it's not fated to be that way. But some see it as this feudal, or that he gets, what he deserves. Like, what does he think is going to happen when you, sort of tickle and antagonize the beast? You're going to get bit.
Is there an argument to be made that he could be more effective if he was not? I mean, if he had not returned, if he had stayed? I know his argument, as you articulated, is that he couldn't imagine not going back, because how can he be this Russian opposition figure if he's not in Russia? But could he have a wider reach if he stayed in Germany and was not?
I think in hindsight, and of course, hindsight being 2020, but I don't think he anticipated a full-scale war like this, a land war in Europe in the 21st century. And again, for many people, they, Russians could not imagine Russia and Ukraine fighting a war. And Navalny's even talked about this, that anybody, tells Russians and Ukrainians to fight each other, that they should stand back to back and be shooting at whoever was telling them to fight. This was just unthinkable. I think if he had somehow known that this was coming, that Putin was going to do something so drastic, that he would have concluded that, in fact, the opposition would need to be in exile, and the future of Russia, if there was going to be one from the opposition, would have to have been made outside of the country, which, as we can see, the repression has only grown. I mean, the climate has only gotten more authoritarian, darker. Lots of people in jail just for, school children for, drawing pictures that call for peace and being anti-war.
Yeah, or sewing tags onto shirts, as the New York Times displayed so recently. When you look at who he draws inspiration from, you talked about how he's embraced this term as dissident. Are there any modern or historical political figures that he, maybe outside of Russia, that he kind of draws inspiration from? It's
interesting. In this flirtation with nationalism, he was looking to Serbia, to the former Yugoslavia, where he thought that there wasn't a possibility of combining sort of progressive liberalism and nationalism. It obviously didn't catch on. He didn't get traction in Russia. I'm not sure that he sees himself as a Mandela-like figure. Again, he saw himself much more as a retail politician. Like, give him the chance to run for mayor. Even early in his career, he had formed something outside of Yabloko, but part of it as a representative of that party, called the Committee to Protect Muscovites. and it was doing retail political stuff. You know, a school that was slated to be knocked down for disabled kids, and in place of it was going to be some development that somebody would, you know, get rich off of, and crusading against that and fighting that, and, you know, real retail grassroots politics, and similarly studied American political organizing when he did a fellowship, the World Fellows program at Yale. I'm just fascinated with the idea that if you know, reach voters, if you empower them, you could, you know, change a country. You know, that kind of very romantic belief in democracy.
Very quaint. Are there any questions in the room as to Navalny or the book? Go ahead.
You touched on it a tiny bit, but what did Navalny have to say about the United States of America before all these crises in his life, and if anything since?
So Navalny spent a lot of time sort of, you know, laughing at allegations that he's some kind of American agent. And there are even conspiracy theories in Russia that when he went to do the Yale Fellows program, the real Navalny stayed and the CIA sent back a double. You know, he has always felt that there was a lot to learn from the United States, and when he was on that fellowship, he came to Washington, was in Congress testifying. You know, he's a guy who trained as a lawyer and trained in financial services, and he loved to read the fine print of prospectuses, and that's where his kind of shareholder activism came from. He'd buy up these small positions in big Russian state companies and then go to the shareholder meetings and demand to know where the money was all being siphoned off from. So on the one hand, you know, some admiration clearly for the United States. On the other hand, when he lived in New Haven for several months, he said he realized he could never live in America. He missed black bread. He wanted to go home. Is that for real, or is that like smart politics? Black bread.
Hi, David. Good to see you. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, you spoke earlier about how a large percentage of the Russian population probably would not support Navalny if he came back out into politics now because of his stance on Ukraine. My question is about the minorities in Russia. As you know, there's more than 100 ethnic groups, millions and millions of indigenous people. You know, I lived in Moscow during the years when the Ruski March would happen once every year. You couldn't go to certain parts of town. You couldn't take the metro on those days if you were any kind of minority. Knowing that Navalny was involved in that, how would minorities in Russia be able to trust him?
You know, it's an excellent question, and this is one of those contradictions, right? When you see some of these videos, and you can still see them on YouTube, and maybe to Navalny's credit, when he's gotten, you know, some really harsh criticism over the years for these videos that he made, including an anti-immigrant sentiment, portraying immigrants as cockroaches, that sort of thing. He's left the videos there, you know, not tried to hide it, although he's denied some of the accusations, and you know, from my understanding, some of these allegations are quite true, where he's used you know, racial slurs, and a lot of in Russia, a lot of the discrimination focuses on Central Asian migrants, and certainly there he's tried to explain that away, saying, you know, he wants restrictions on migration because you know, illegal migrants are then exploited as workers. Like, look, come on, this is not about protecting laborers. This is about trying to find a mainstream political position that plays to some of the worst instincts in people. And there, again, this is not unfamiliar to those of us who've covered politics in the United States. You know, on any of these positions, right? I covered Congress for a while, and Congress, no matter which party was in the majority, has always been a pro-gun, anti-choice Congress, right? You know, he was looking for these views, and the anti-immigrant stuff, you know, often, you know, crosses the different sides of the aisle or the full political spectrum. So I think there is a lot of genuine and legitimate skepticism, and also now among Ukrainians. I mean, many Ukrainians despise Navalny and believe that he is, you know, not that much better, if not just as bad as Putin. You know, some of them not realizing that he is in fact Ukrainian himself. But even when they learn that, saying, yeah, but he's got this Russian chauvinism going on that that would exclude him, you know, preclude him from ever being a leader in their mind of the country.
It's a good question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, David. Kaitlan, I have a question about sort of labels. You talk about dissident. Do you think Alexey, and by extension his team, would consider himself a martyr Obviously, he's alive, but considering his situation, do you think he would view himself as a martyr?
It's interesting about the label. I mean, certainly they view him as a political prisoner. Certainly they view him as oppressed, as persecuted. So I'm not sure they would disavow that, other than to say he's very much alive and they very much believe they can one day make a political comeback and transform Russia. Otherwise, they sort of have to give up on everything they've worked for all these years. But yeah, at some point, we're not playing semantics, even though it is core. I mean, this question of would he be viewed as a dissident or would he be viewed as a mainstream politician really was core to his identity. I don't think Navalny wants to see himself as a martyr. I think he would like to get back to his family and back to his politics.
We probably have time for one more. Go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned as you were reporting this out, it was hard, or you had to steel yourself to not get swept up, in his charisma. I wonder, as you were working on this book, was there anything that you found out about him that was surprising to you or even troubling to you?
It's a great question, and thanks to some Washington Post friends who are here. It's great to see you. Certainly the racism, some of it goes to kind of off-color humor, he would say. There was a trip again. I talked about how Navalny really is part of this generation that loved to travel, and he met his wife actually at a Turkish resort when they were both on vacation. He did a trip to San Francisco and was blogging from San Francisco and making gay jokes. Stuff that in this day and age certainly would seem way off-key. And so some of that might come from sort of an attempt at humor or a different generation of humor. Other parts of it where there's one really ugly scene where he'd used a racial slur while with a Central Asian, a colleague of Central Asian descent at Yabloko, at the political party. And it took a while to sort of track that down, and really, and this woman who was the sort of target of this had spoken about it enough that I could find interviews that she had done and where she really laid this out, and you realize it was really a kind of an ugly remark. So there is some of that was quite dark. On some of the other things, I think sometimes the Ukrainians are overly tough on him, given at least now the clear position against the war and the fact that Russia needs to withdraw immediately and needs to compensate Ukraine for what he's described as a criminal war. But he still tried to have it both ways on Crimea, saying the borders should be, everybody knows what the borders are, which as they were defined in 1991. You could say that Crimea is Ukraine. That might be too blunt. Should we do one more?
Go ahead.
Thanks so much. Thanks lots. This has been a really interesting discussion. It sounds like a fascinating book. As someone who follows Russia, but not in the depth that many people in this room here do, what I'm trying to get a handle on is, does Navalny matter in Russia today? And if so, in what ways?
It's a really good question, and our international editor of the Washington Post, Doug Gell, who asked me the same question as the book was coming out, like why does he matter? And it's important to think about that. And I think I'd give several answers. I mean, one reason that it matters is because the Russia we see now wasn't necessarily fated to be this way. There were alternatives. In many ways, Putin is the more accidental president than Navalny might have been if there had been free and fair elections, right? I mean, Yeltsin stepping down and this former KGB agent getting appointed, so it's never quite won the office in the way that you would have hoped Russia as a democracy would have developed. So that's one aspect to it. I think does he matter to Russia? I think it matters for the continuing recognition or realization of the rest of the world that not all of Russia thinks the way Putin does, that there are quite a few Russians, and many have now fled their country, who are going, nothing compared to what Ukraine is going through, but the level of upheaval, and at the Post we've written some about this historic exodus that has been underway, the people that have had to go and flee into exile, including many of Navalny's team, who actually would like to live at home. They would like to be back. And so it matters in that way as a symbol of, the fact that the fight for Russia's future, for Russia's soul, is not over yet. If we want to look more broadly, I would say, we've talked about this, what lesson might Americans take away from all of this? And that is, some gratitude for the durability of our democratic system and the pillars. I mean, there have been some challenges and threats to that, but overall, the systems have, and the pillars of democracy hold fast, and you shouldn't take that for granted. When I was leaving Moscow, I spent 4 years as a correspondent for the New York Times there, and Russian friends said, "Oh, you're leaving because the political climate," this is obviously after Crimea and the war in Donbass had already started, "You're leaving because the climate here is getting really bad, is getting really, really ugly, right?" And I said, "No," I said, the New York Times asked me to come back to Washington because we have a presidential election next year, 2016, and unlike here, we actually don't know who's going to win. There's work to do. So not taking that for granted, and remembering that, Navalny is that symbol of, democracy is worth fighting for and protecting, I think is another reason why it matters and he matters.
It's a great question. The book is fantastic. Everyone should read it. Thank you for having this conversation. Thank you all for bringing such great questions tonight.
Thank you, Kaitlan, for a great talk.
You have to sign my copy.
We'll be signing books.